Hi everyone, Carl Steele here. This is English 4101, the second video about Boethius' Consolation philosophy. We'll be talking about books 3 and 4, but since we have two presenters talking about this, I don't want to spend a lot of time on this in this video. So I have a manuscript here. This is at Yale, the Beinecke Library, manuscript 85, and the reverse side of the 43rd page of this, the 43rd verso, and it's the beginning of book 2 of the Consolation and the third poem, meter 3, as the Boethian scholars say. And I just wanted to show this to you as an example of a particularly nice medieval manuscript to get you a sense of how people might have actually used this in the Middle Ages. So you have here the poem itself, and then around it in text, it's very, very hard, particularly for me to read, is commentary. And we have some interlinear commentary here and also some commentary here, which is, explaining difficult words, providing basically footnotes or almost like hyperlinks to various ideas, explaining who Phoebus is, for example, or what kind of weather systems they're talking about. So if you have a scholar reading Boethius, they might produce something like this with a lot of glossing is a technical term, or commentary. And I looked at this whole manuscript, and what's interesting to me is that about maybe 2/5 of the manuscript has this amount of commentary on it. So whoever was doing it maybe ran out of steam or died or just got fed up or lazy or just gave up on the project in the way that we all do sometimes. So that's just a nice thing to see. And so if you see a medieval manuscript like this and that writing around the edges, what you see there is basically commentary explanations. Anyway, so today in talking about Consolations 3 and 4, I'm going to just give a quick summary of the key issues, but again, we'll be getting into more detail about this on Tuesday. I'm going to talk in more detail about that etymology, or the idea of the relationship between gangsters and free men and freedom, and correct myself. Actually, I made a mistake in class. And also then ultimately talking about a particular subject that's interesting to me, which is the question of animality and who gets to be human. And here we have another manuscript of the Consolation, the very beginning of it. This is at Oxford in England, the Bodleian Library. And it's, as you can see here, it's an illustration of Boethius in Lady Philosophy. And he's in prison, so you can see the bars there. And that's how it's beginning to let us know where he is. So the key issues in 3 and 4, as I see them, is the kind of philosophical point that money, honor, political power, fame, pleasure, healthy and beautiful bodies, that all these things, which Boethius has philosophy considers serially, that none of these things offer true happiness. You may think that money offers you happiness, but in fact, your money can't stay with you forever, and you're always terrified of it having it stolen. Honor stretches only so far. You can always go someplace where people aren't going to think your political titles matter. Political power is fragile. You can be assassinated. Fame travels only so far. You might travel overseas and people won't know who you are. Maybe you're a star on French television, but in America that doesn't count for very much. Physical pleasure, of course, you have hangovers and all kinds of problems associated with that. And your healthy and beautiful body, well, if people can just look inside themselves, they'd see their intestines and they would think, oh, I'm not so beautiful after all. So none of these things offer true happiness. None of them really have that kind of permanence or perpetuity or security that true happiness offers. And Boethius basically is arguing through the course of the Consolation that if it doesn't offer some kind of permanence, it doesn't really exist, because only things that really truly are permanent really exist in an authentic way. So none of these things, money, honor, political power, none of them are self-sufficient. They can't sustain themselves. They don't have permanence. They're fragile. And so you need to find, if you're looking for happiness, you need to look for something that's self-sufficient, something that can sustain itself, something that doesn't need anything else to keep itself going, something that's always going to be what it is. So that's the only thing that can be truly happy, because it can never be worried about anything else. And so therefore, the only kind of true happiness you can find is simply to be God. It's raising the bar very, very high for what counts as happiness. You may think it's nice to pet your cat, or to play with your dog, or to have a nice plate of noodles, but no. In fact, you're falling short of true happiness because you are not experiencing the self-sufficiency of being God himself. And so the goal of this work, in a very Neoplatonic way, which we can talk about maybe on Tuesday or maybe in the next class after that, is to try to get humans as close to being like God as possible, because that gets you to that permanence and self-security of being what's called the first mover, the thing that moves everything else without itself moving, the primum mobile, the first mover. So everything that happens, this is in book 4, Boethius says, now you may think, well, what about all the unhappiness down here? It doesn't look like God's in charge, actually. And the goal of books 4, and especially book 5, is to convince us that, in fact, God has a plan, and that's providence, and that God is in charge, and he is making things go. So that's what's going on basically in books 3 and 4 of the Consolation. So in class, I talked about this word gangster that has an important role in the film The Act of Killing, which is a documentary that basically interviews mass killers who are involved in the killing of 1 million to 2 million people in Indonesia in 1965, with pretty well documented the backing of American and English intelligence services, MI5, and the CIA. And so a lot of the people who are involved in this are still alive, and because they remained in power, they're very well established now. And so the documentary interviews these people, and on more than one occasion, they talk about the word gangster being related to the word free man. And so I said, well, that's just not the case. Well, I made a very obvious error, and you could probably think of what that error is. But here, I'll get to that in just a moment. This is a screenshot from the film. It's actually footage from a television interview show where the interviewer, who's pictured here, has got several of these basically mass killers on to interview them. And she's very enthusiastic about meeting them. She doesn't judge them at all. She's in fact very proud of what they did, and they're very proud of what they did. And they talk openly about murdering people. And it's really quite eerie to watch. And so she says, in those days, movie theater gangsters were very well known, because one of the key figures in this film used to work at a movie theater. And she says to him, what's the origin of the word gangster? And so here's the man who's kind of the star of the show, who probably killed 1,000 people himself with his own hands, a man who goes by the name Anwar Congo. And he says, actually, gangster comes from freeman. And I went, oh, that's not the case. Well, it's not the case in English. And gangster has no connection to the word freeman in English. It's related to the word go. And gangster suggests groups of people who go together. But of course, I'm not speaking English. That's my stupid mistake. So I spent a lot of time today trying to find that screenshot and then trying to figure out what the Indonesian word for gangster was, looking at the Indonesian subtitles, not a language I speak, and looking for the word that might correspond to the particular word for gangster in Indonesian, et cetera, et cetera. It took me a while because the Indonesian word they're using there is preman, which we translate as that gangster into English. And that comes from the Dutch word freeman, which of course means free man in English. So in fact, Anwar Congo is correct. The Indonesian word for gangster, one of those words is preman, comes from the Dutch word for freeman. And there's various ironies about that maybe we can talk about, but really we're starting to get very far from Boethius. But the reason I wanted to bring this up in part was to correct myself, but also to say, is the preman the gangster actually a free man? Is the gangster a free man? Boethius would say, absolutely not, because the gangster can't actually do anything. So here's how he proves it. And this is a key part of the end of book 3. If God can do anything, there's nothing he cannot do. This is a standard notion of what God is, right? Once we start to get to a monotheism, and we have a monotheism, for example, in Christianity and Islam, Judaism, and Neoplatonism is basically monotheistic as well. There is nothing that God cannot do. And they also believe that God is good. God is perfectly good. So there's one thing that God can't do, and he can't do evil. But if God can do everything, that means the thing he can't do is in fact nothing, because there's basically the set of things that he can't do has to be nothing. Therefore, right, I want you to sit and think about the implications of this. This may feel like wordplay to you, but this is a key part of Boethius's argument. Basically, if you do evil, you're accomplishing nothing. You're doing the thing that doesn't exist, because evil doesn't actually exist. It's non-existence. It's the thing that's outside the plenitude of actually existing things. And so the more evil you do, the more you're approaching non-existence. It's really quite strange to think about. Therefore, I mean, the key thing is wicked people are aimed at a false happiness, and the evil they do takes them further away from happiness. And that's in book 4, prose 2, on page 91, if you're reading the Penguin translation. So this is how they might, Boethius and Lady Philosophy might respond to Anwar Congo in the act of killing and say, you believe that you're a free man and that you're able to do anything because you're a criminal and you're very powerful and you're able to kill all these people. But in fact, everything you do is taking you further away from existence and closer to nothingness, right? And that's a very difficult thing to wrap our heads around. But this is the consolation that's being offered to Boethius before he's about to be, as he believes, unjustly executed. So this gets us closer to another interesting point, which is that if the function of a human being is to do good, because the function of a human being is to use their reason to try to make themselves more like God, then a human who's not doing those things is in fact becoming a kind of non-existent person. They're ceasing to be what they are, because when the thing is not acting the way it's supposed to be acting, it exists less as itself. A foot that isn't being used for walking, it's being used just to like pick up pencils. This is an argument Boethius makes. Doesn't really exist as much as a foot that's being used for its proper purpose. Now, from a disability rights perspective, we should disagree with that. But he makes that argument. Basically, a human being is sort of like, who isn't doing good, is sort of like a foot that isn't being used to walk. And therefore, a human being who isn't doing good doesn't really exist as a human anymore. That means they exist more like an animal. And so here's the argument that he makes in book 4. Anything that turns away from goodness ceases to exist, and thus the wicked cease to be what they once were. That they used to be human is shown by the human appearance of their body, which still remains. So it was by falling into wickedness that they also lost their human nature. Now, since only goodness can raise a man above the level of humankind, it follows that it is proper that wickedness thrusts down to a level below mankind those whom it has dethroned from the condition of being human. So if you engage in wicked behavior, you cease to be as human as somebody who's doing good. In fact, you become animal, because the goal of a human being is to head towards being divine. And we'll talk about the implications of this in class and what it means to divide humans into humans and animals, to say that in fact there's only a subset of human beings who are actually fully human. And then we can even raise this final point, which is that if the goal of a human being is to become godlike, then in fact there's really no place for the human as such to be. The human is always poised on this balance between either tending towards animality, if they choose to do evil, or tending towards godhood, if they choose to do good, right? But the position of being human itself is nothing more, I believe in Boethius, than simply marking that space where the human can go one direction or the other. The middle position is a position of decision in Boethius, and the human as such, I believe, in Boethius doesn't really exist. So we can talk about that more perhaps on Tuesday. I'll just let you keep pondering that, and looking forward to class.